broadcast system. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. This is our advice to take the following steps. If exposed, remove emergency broadcast system.
Podcast for the curious mind. I don't know what that means.
Broadcasting live from a German-made microphone deep within the multifamily dwelling bunker. I am Corey Hussing here solo today on Phantom Facts. We have author and just quite an amazing career, Betty Kovak. Kovaks? I should have asked before. I'm so bad. So we have now Betty Kovaks has a PhD from the University of California, Irvine in comparative literature and theory of symbolic and mythic language, which I am very excited to just discuss that subject alone. But she's also the author of 2 books, Miracle of Death, There Is Nothing But Life, and her most recent one, Merchants of Light, the consciousness that is changing the world. So we're happy to have Betty Kovaks on the show. Before we do that, a quick ad from our sponsor, Break Fix Professionals. Is your computer acting like your New Year's resolution? Broken? Then call Break Fix Professionals. Break Fix Professionals will scan and clean your system for free. That's right, free. And no credit card is required. But that's not all. They are your go-to source for all your misfit PC needs. Windows or Apple, well, it doesn't matter. To Break Fix Professionals, call now at 605-951-9898 or learn more at breakfixpros.com. Break Fix Professionals. If you can't fix your New Year's resolution, at least fix your PC. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Betty. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
I don't think you recognized, we're just, our show is just full of blue collar workers. And so I'm nervous to talk to someone as all the
No.
been through. So you can tell me shut up whenever you want. That's fine. Tell me a little bit about your what got you to the point where you're at now, where you have written this second book, Merchants of Light, Consciousness that is Changing the World. When did this focus start for you? I mean, was it at a young age or?
Well, I would be interested in your answer to that in your case, what got you into this. I think we all are, we look around us and we hear what life is about and we think that can't be it. That can't be enough. There's something else going on. And I think that probably though, at a pretty early age, I feared death because I heard of all of the deaths in my family. My mother's parents were both orphans and people seemed to die young. And she told me those stories. And so I couldn't quite figure out how can someone be here now and then just disappear, So I had those questions, but they didn't bug me down. I really just lived a normal life of trying to figure out things. But by the time I went to college, I really went to college because I thought maybe I can find out there, but there, of course, I heard about the scientific worldview, which is more heinous than anything I thought myself. So, but at any rate, I continued to just try to answer those questions. There's got to be more to it than what I'm hearing everywhere or what I'm discovering in religion and the church.
Were you raised in a religious family then?
No, my family did not go to church, but they were open to it. And my brother and I always did because there's where we met kids. When we moved to a new place, we went to a church. And in those days, they had a lot of great programs for kids and no pressure about anything. But I would hear the stories. And I would hear the stories of Jesus, and it was a wonderful model of a man who was kind and loving and just. It was a good model, but I couldn't believe the other stories about Jesus. So I had a hard time, and I remember even as a kid thinking, well, Christianity must be true because it's so old. People have believed it so long. But that was my first mistake. So I started studying religions and tried to really figure out what's really going on here. And then that took me back to mythology. As Robert Graves says, that's a study of someone else's religion. And then it took me to shamanism. So I went to South America twice to work with shamans, and there is where I found what I was looking for, not so much in their present practice, but in the fact that if you want to know something, you've got to experience it yourself. It's not something that's going to be told to you to the left brain. And I always wanted to know, how can we know something? And that was through our own experience of it.
Where were you? Where were you raised at?
Well, I was born in Alabama, Depression years, and then I lived in Arkansas and then Michigan, and so it was brought up really between the North and the South.
So yeah, I mean, you would have to adapt to several different cultures as you moved then.
Yes, and then I ended up going to Europe to live and to study. And then we came out to California, with New York and California. So
Oh,
pretty
sure.
much, yeah, many parts of the country.
I, what was I guess at what age were you in Europe?
I was in my 20s and 30s. Mhm.
Okay. All right. So about 20 years over in Europe then.
Well, no, not that long. I was at different times.
Oh, sure.
I I worked in Austria and then in Germany, and then I married in this country. I met a refugee, a Hungarian refugee who had fought in the revolution
Oh,
against
good.
communism in Hungary. So when that country was freed, or at least when refugees were cleared and they could go back, because he had his entire family there, then we visited.
Hmm.
So it was a kind of constant back and forth.
What do you? I guess what you mentioned you heard the Christian view of things, and I'm just sort of curious about that because these stories about Jesus and other stories found within the Bible, they all sort of relate to a sort of a spiritual side, like another world where there's, beings and creatures and they're fighting their own wars and battles. And then you have this human development. And it sort of seems like as far as in theology taught in Christianity, it's kept, those are two separate realms that cannot interact with each other except on rare occasions, and that's the stories about those are written. But this, what I've, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't, I'm, like I said, I'm just an electrician. I don't know much about any of this. So if I'm speaking out of line, please correct me. But to me, it seems like maybe that was by design to keep people more focused on materialistic aspects of life.
Well, when I read your interest in this, I thought, great, because you figured it out. So don't demean yourself. You know that there's something going on that isn't quite the way it is. And I could start very quickly by saying that it's our heritage. Now, I know I didn't earlier. It's our heritage to be connected to other dimensions. We are a multidimensional world, and we have everything we need to be connected with the spirit dimension. In fact, that's our heritage, to be connected. And so earlier cultures in the West, even though, the West always thought, well, we don't have a spiritual tradition. Well, we do, but it was covered up and suppressed and repressed so that we wouldn't know anything about it. In other words, whenever people want to have power over us, they lie to us, they demean us. We're not valuable, we don't know anything, and only they do. So no, we have had these stories, our true stories have definitely been suppressed. And for instance, well, I'll let you say something at that point, but I have some examples of that.
No, I'm curious what the examples are, and like when did this suppression start?
Well, we have historical knowledge of it starting 621 BCE in Judaism, because, and this is, so many of these discoveries have just taken place in the 20th century because they were so suppressed that we didn't know about them in many cases. Now, Margaret Barker has a scholar, Old Testament scholar, she's done incredible work. And she has shown that the first temple Judaism before 621 BCE was a shamanic experiential, it was a mystical tradition in which we did experience the other side for ourselves. That's our heritage. That's what shamanism is all about. You experience it. Someone isn't telling you what the truth is. You have to find out for yourself by going into altered states of being. So she showed that the first temple tradition was mystical. Now we know that before that, the ancient Egyptian civilization was an incredible shamanic, mystical, scientific culture, and they influenced Judaism. But 621, the Deuteronomist said, well, there is, no, you're totally wrong. The scriptures are not correct. They got rid of the spiritual literature in ancient Judaism. They got rid of it. And they said that actually we are flawed human beings. And the feminine was very much worshipped, and or maybe not even worship, but the feminine was certainly looked to as the symbol of soul, of the other dimensional reality. So the feminine was very important. We know that later traditions in the West don't have the feminine, but the feminine was very important. She was a symbol of life, life-giving, soul-loving.
Betty, I'm sorry, I got kicked off there for a minute.
I saw that.
But I want to pick this up again. So you're talking in the book of Deuteronomy. There was, because Deuteronomy isn't that, and refresh my memory, isn't that the book of, like a sort of similar to Leviticus, a lot of measurements and a lot of laws being established, and then the establishment of the legal structure for the state of Israel.
Well, you put your finger on it, because before, in a spiritual, a mystical tradition, we have the inner experience of the divine within us, and that guides us in how we are to live. But the Deuteronomists came in when they got rid of that mystical tradition. They came in with, no, we will tell you how to behave. Here are the laws of Israel. This is what you do. Follow this. Completely different system. We don't know for sure who the Deuteronomists were, but they were priests, and they threw out the spiritual literature, and they threw out the symbols of the feminine, and with later it's patriarchal religion. There's no feminine there, but the feminine was a symbol. She was a symbol of life-giving, of nurturing, of loving, and of the spirit of the other dimension. Now, many Jews did not go along with this, and they went to Egypt, and they took that spiritual literature with them. Others later went to the Dead Sea. Around the Dead Sea, you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, and we did an episode on the Copper Scrolls out by the Dead Sea too, which I don't know if you've done any research on or heard about even, but there's a huge amount of copper scrolls that have been discovered out by the Dead Sea as well, from a Levitical priesthood from, I can't remember the time range, but it was built next to a city, Qatar. I can't remember what the city's name was, but it's shaped like a miniature version of Jerusalem. It's very interesting. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's very interesting. I know about the mystics who lived near the Dead Sea, and they had their own tradition because they would not accept the Second Temple tradition. Neither would Jews in Egypt, the Essenes. They were also in the whole Palestinian area, and Therapeutic. There were many, many Jews who said, nope, we don't go along with this. We are mystical. We are spiritual, mystical beings. And they kept that literature, and they kept that tradition. And I think eventually that Judaic tradition emerged much, much later in Kabbalah.
I was going to ask you because Kabbalah would be sort of a Hebrew version of what was probably learned in Egypt, and then by the Akkadians and Sumerians.
Well, I think Egypt certainly was a powerful spiritual, scientific, mystical tradition. And the ancient writers say so. They knew that. So, of course, the Hebrews would have been influenced by this ancient tradition, but they developed their own as well. They had their own experiences. So Solomon's temple was, symbolic of that, is that in the Holy of Holies, that's where the priest went and experienced the divine feminine or soul. So yes, it was influenced by Egypt, I'm sure, but it had its own tradition. So that was 621. Now, just another little bit about the Deuteronomist. They told stories that were not true. In Sumer, which existed before, let's say 2,500, there are often trees with the fruit hanging on it, and both the god and the goddess offering that fruit to anyone who is willing and able to take it. This is the fruit of our own heart-loving intelligence that we are all capable of experiencing. In other words, it was known that we are in the process of developing when we're born, and that we have the potential to experience altered states of consciousness, vast consciousness, cosmic consciousness, or Christ consciousness. This tree was symbolic of that. And the divine is offering this to us. The Deuteronomist, and you know that story, is that here's the tree in the garden of good and evil, and you can eat of anything else, but you cannot eat of this. This is not a true story. And how do we know our true stories? We know because our true stories are never negative. They are everything to support our evolution. And they are organized, they are structured by the organizing principles of our own psyche or soul, heart consciousness. They are not made up by the left brain. This Deuteronomist story is made up by the left brain to control us.
So the symbolization of what's being told in Genesis with Adam and Eve being told not to partake of the tree of knowledge of good and bad.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then Eve is deceived, which would be along the Deuteronomist line because it's a patriarchal society, right? So of course the woman would be the weak link in that story. And then Adam partakes because he is influenced by Eve, and then they're banished from the Garden of Eden, and are cursed with having to do hard labor, and the childbearing is painful. All these curses that God puts on them, and then they go out and create mankind, and that's been altered from what you're saying in the Sumerian text.
Well, it was the tradition before the Deuteronomist. It would even have been the Judaic tradition, because they were mystics, and the tree is offering mystical experience, altered states. So we know. And what do we know? We know that, first of all, we are divine. Everything in the universe is divine, and we are immortal, and we are creative. Well, if you want to control people, you don't want them to know that, right? You want to demean them, devalue them, see them as flawed, and kick them out. They're not worthy of living in the garden of life. This is by those who want to control us, have power over us for whatever reason. Maybe the Deuteronomists really just wanted to keep the Jews alive and safe, and therefore they could control them better with these stories. But they were false stories. They have nothing to do with our reality, but they have had a lot to do with our culture, because whether we believe those stories or not, there is that feeling that we're not valuable, certainly we're not divine or immortal,
Well, it seems from what I've studied about just Western religion dating back to Egypt, and it's fascinating because to me, I sometimes wonder, was Egypt the first, minor world power that figured out control through religion, or through, I guess in this instance, control over someone's consciousness? And, they use the Trinity aspect, the triune gods. And then they had sub gods that were, adopted in from other cultures. And then you see that as, Greece becomes a world power. They adopt that type of religion. They have their main god Zeus, and then their minor gods, and then Rome adopts Greek religion, and then you see this shift in Christianity about 300 CE, where Christianity makes this shift to a triune God, a sacrifice being needed, but it would seem to me like the purpose of all of that is just they look at what these civilizations were able to grow to be because they had that control over their subjects.
Well, that's often true, but we have a powerful shamanic mystic tradition from the cave cultures and the San Bushmen, for instance, in Africa. For thousands of years, they knew how to achieve cosmic consciousness.
What's this? I noticed that in one of the questions I could ask you, and I was like, I have no clue what a Sans Bushman is.
Well, yeah, we don't, because we haven't heard much about them. But Graham Hancock calls them a murdered culture. They've been attacked by everybody. These are people in Africa who live completely in nature. They don't really have a lot of possessions, and the West has looked at them as just nothing. Just they're not developed. It's the way we looked at them. But little did we know that these people were very wise. They know, and they say for 65,000 years, so that would even be longer than the cave cultures, that they have known how to achieve these altered states of consciousness. They have incredible powers or abilities. For instance, when they're away from where the others are, if they need to be in contact with them, their heart will start, get this little tapping in the heart, and then they know. I mean, they have developed abilities that we all have but don't know about. But the important thing about them is that they have no possessions. They live in nature. They're very harmonious with them and very happy. There are very few of them left now because we've killed them off the best we could and had understood nothing about them. But they're very wise and beautiful people, and I write about them in the book. But ancient Egypt had an incredibly powerful shaman, mystic, scientific tradition that we're just beginning to realize. And I think in the future, we're going to see this is something we could go back to. It was about experiencing it ourselves. It was not about teaching you to do or laws that you should follow. And so we know this now because of the paintings on the temple walls are actually the rituals that they engaged in to trigger these experiences. So I think it was the actual experience that influenced First Temple Judaism. And then that switched.
I just wanted to clarify, when you say First Temple, you're talking about Solomon's temple.
Yes.
Right? The second temple would be Herod's temple.
Well, yes, it was later. Yes, the second, and they did away with the first temple. So, and then the Greeks never really quite caught on to the depth of the Egyptian. And, we've always gone back to the Greeks and the Hebrews, but there are some very wonderful scholars who are going very deep into this real spiritual tradition of Egypt. And they are saying, this is where we're going to find our own root, is in this powerful, mystical, scientific tradition. And it's even, I talk about it in my book, and even the temples were structured in such a way that when you go into the temple, it would trigger the frequencies needed to experience that particular altered state. Each temple was different. I mean, it was structured to trigger our own inner experience. Now, of course, that changed in time, but I think that there were those cultures, and that's so much of what my book is about, those cultures that knew we are divine, immortal, and creative, and that they wanted us to experience that. So
when you say shaman, I guess maybe clarify what do you mean by that? What is a shaman?
Well, there are a lot of shysters who are shamans, but the term itself means inner experience, how to trigger inner experiences so that we know for ourselves. We don't
So,
have to listen to anybody else.
so you're your own individual shaman
Exactly,
then.
exactly.
I see.
And now the Greeks did have that in the mystery schools. The mystery schools were a continuation of that tradition of experiencing. So, for instance, if you went to Eleusis, as so many Greeks did, it was structured in such a way that you had your own experience, that there is no death. There is no death. And that's the number one thing that every civilization must know before it can truly create, is that there's no death. And we simply step out of the body, but into another dimension. And that's what people experienced in the mystery school. But it was really, well, let me say, Peter Kingsley is a scholar who's done incredible work with the pre-Socratic philosophers who were very early Greeks. And some of them tried to make it clear to Plato, it's the inner experience that's everything. And it didn't really go deep in Greek culture, but it was there. So I think now in the West, we are trying to find in our own culture, and we have in the 20th century, these roots that we have that ability. And it has been suppressed, but we're finding it now.
My number one rule is not to make the interview about me, but I am going to do that right now. Um, because have you ever heard of, you've obviously heard of Nikola Tesla. Um, he's very, I'm an
Yeah.
electrician, and so he's very much beloved
Great,
among
great.
our trade, and what's interesting is, he had a lot of, he never called himself an inventor. He called himself a discoverer. And he did a lot of discovering with frequencies, a lot of in-depth research in his later life towards frequencies. And I sort of wonder, do we see these modern day shamans operating among us? I understand that we each individual can tap into their consciousness, but some people I feel like do it at a higher level than others.
It's true. There are many different fields of frequency. And we have the ability to tune into those fields, but we have to learn how to do it. And I think a civilization is not a civilization if it doesn't understand that when we are born, we're in the process of coming into our full abilities. And the civilization should be structured to help us do that, to enter into these fields of frequencies, altered states of consciousness, as they're often called. We have the ability to experience it all, cosmic consciousness. But because there have been so many who feared that or didn't understand that, they've suppressed it. And I think when you don't have that inner experience, you don't have that depth of knowing who you are, that you want to control others because you're not controlling yourself. So I think if we don't have that experience, these are the ones who are trying to control us, to have power over us. Now, Tesla himself was very much aware of these things. In fact, he felt he had come from another world into this one to bring this, but look how he was suppressed, feared.
Yes.
And so many people have known this, but they can't get their message across because if you want power, you're willing to do a lot to get it. And to get it, you have to suppress who people are. Once we begin to find out that we have power, each of us, then they can't control us as well.
Why do you think, I mean, obviously it's a matter of control. They want to have control and almost treat us as some sort of as a human resource, where we can, produce what it needs to be produced, and, live short enough so we don't have to hit retirement, and,
Yeah,
so,
right.
um, but obviously they've been very afraid of this self-awakening
Exactly.
happening. Like, to what extent do you think they are going to try to prevent?
I think that what we have seen is that if we get caught in that not knowing who we are and playing God in the Garden of Eden, that I know what's best, you don't, I will control you, that there are no limits to what they will do or what we will do if we were in that place. They are our brothers and sisters who now we've seen what they've done throughout history. In fact, I would say the West is actually a history. We are what we have been denied. We are suppressed people. We don't know. We're just beginning to wake up. Wait a minute. Look at these cultures. We had our own spiritual tradition. It wasn't just the East. But we now see in the Great Reset, for example, and with this global desire to have a world government where we do not have anything to say about it, we can't elect them, and that we will own nothing, and they say be happy. Well, we won't, and who's going to own it? They will. And we have to be aware of the fact that there are no limits to this illness of not knowing who we are, and therefore I need to control you and see you as unworthy, and you don't deserve to live in the garden. Therefore, I can kill you off if need be. It's a cancer within the human species that we really need to recognize.
Well, and how do you think that's going to come about?
Well, they have their own plans. They write about it, and we can read it. If you mention
No, I mean for people to be able to achieve this inner consciousness.
I see. That's a better thing.
Yes. No.
Well, that's what every culture should be focused on. If we want to be civilized people, then we have to know something about who we are. We haven't even known much about the brain. We haven't even known until recently that the heart is a brain component. It's the fifth brain component. We have been.
What I didn't know. I don't know anything about that. What is that? What do you mean?
And we should make it possible that everyone being born would know about it. But what we do is that, we've developed we were probably fully developed around 200,000 BCE, but we have the old reptilian brain, which is wonderful, because in a case of emergency, that reptilian brain will come forth and do things. I found myself doing things that I didn't have sense enough to do, but my reptilian brain came forth. And then we have the old brain and the old mammalian, the new mammalian, the frontal lobes, and the heart. And if we know this, we can really focus on the heart is one of the best things. But I think the first stage of any kind of learning is just know the facts about it. And that is that we have this incredible brain. If the energy moves up through the reptilian brain, through the mammalian brains, the prefrontal lobes, and into the heart consciousness, and circles that way, always moving forward, we can achieve anything. But every culture that does not want you to use your heart consciousness or your mind, it will try to make you afraid. Fear, what does it do? Shoots us right back to the reptilian brain so that we can protect ourselves. But without fear, without that kind of craziness, the brain will work beautifully, and we all feel. But that in our cultures, remember the old saying, I don't care what you feel, I want to know facts. Well, feeling is a fact. So the heart, if we really focus on the heart and feeling, we will know a lot by our feeling. The Egyptians said a culture cannot evolve if it is not deeply connected to the heart and the feeling consciousness. So it's that's first of all, we have to know this and begin to realize, for instance, there's Heart Math organization. You might look at that, because they have done a lot of scientific experiments with heart consciousness and how to meditate with focus on the heart. And kids who were aggressive in school, when they did this kind of work with Heart Math, they weren't. Because when your right brain is connected to the heart and feeding the left brain, we're not aggressive. That's just a fact. And these kids were also, with this kind of connection to the heart, they were doing so much better in school. So that's a good organization to start with. You can learn a lot. And I think we're just beginning to realize, if we can't develop heart consciousness, we're going to self-destruct. and destroy the whole planet. But our ancestors knew that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sort of beckons back to the story of when they build the Tower of Babel, right? And the punishment for uniting together was the separation of languages to force them to break apart, and it seems like that's, and like you said, we don't know who this Deuteronomus is, but that feels like a Deuteronomus type of
Story.
story, like
That's right. You're right. Yes, it's well, we all have a native language, which is symbolic language that comes from the right brain. That is the structuring, organizing stories that are true. They're true stories because they're organized by our psyche. And that's the right brain. That is what we need to look to. That's our first language. I had a dream one time that I was in a country whose language I didn't know, but I was teaching them their native language, which is symbolic language. So um, we could all connect through the symbolic language, but someone else can't tell us what a dream means, because the feeling we experience with the symbol, and the symbol ignites that feeling. So we have the key to the dream. But symbolic language is everybody's first language, and it's connected to the heart, to the true principles of our evolution.
is that what is that what the Kabbalah is? Because I know they put heavy emphasis on the language and numbers as well. They've got, was it nine? They've got 9 circles and 22 lines. 22 lines are all interconnected, which it stands for each letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And then
This is symbolic. Yes, it's a symbolic system. And
because there's accounts in where King Saul goes and visits a spirit medium to rise Samuel from the dead, and sometimes I think those stories are described, dumbed down. But I mean, to me, that's describing a seance of some sort. I mean, that would be involved in being able to be your own shaman, right? Is to bring such things forth.
Exactly. And even good mediums today will say, well, they're doing this until we all learn how to do it. We are all potential mediums, potential shamans. And that's what we've been told we aren't. It's, imagine being born in original sin, every child, and this horrible that many people have really believed. But even when we don't believe it, we don't have the best feeling about our abilities. We are fantastic beings. We just need to know who we are. What do we have that allows us to experience the cosmos? We are holographic. As the poet Blake said, the universe is in every grain of sand. The universe is in us, and we can experience it. And I think if those in power know anything about that, they want to control that and not let us know, that we are unworthy, we're flawed. It's just like now this whole idea of transhumanism, the idea that we should have all of these chips in our head to know more. It's not a matter of knowledge, knowing things as much as it is achieving our potential and connecting with the universe. So if there's artificial intelligence that will help the knee or the elbow or the legs, whatever, great, but it should never interfere with our deep human potential. To transhumanism would be merging us with the machine.
Yep.
No, we don't. We want to maintain our potential. Most people don't know what they have, but we've got to nurture that as a civilization. Otherwise, we're not really a civilization, and we haven't been. We need to know these things and find ways to develop them.
Well, you think even within the Native American culture here in the U.S., a lot of those tribes and nations were deeply connected to their surroundings. I want to bring it back to this idea of control by the politicians and using whatever means. You would think they would use this ability for evil purposes as well, wouldn't you?
Of course. It's always, you could say, evil when someone wants to control another person
Right.
rather than nurture cooperation and nurture each other's abilities. We all came to this planet with a particular gift. The native people say a medicine that we create for the world, each of us. Or this other beautiful image from a mystical vision that someone had in a near-death experience is that she saw this great tapestry of all different colors of threads. It was absolutely beautiful. And she realized that every single thread, or that would be every single individual, was needed to complete that tapestry. We are very important, each one of us. And that's what those who want to control us don't want us to know.
Well, not only do they not want us to know, but I feel like they know that it's true, and they partake in it too. I mean, with that knowledge comes power. Like you said, if you keep the mind in a constant, would you say it was fear and the other thing? But just this
Yeah,
constant
fear.
jumping.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and you think of me just, and I'm 36. So I guess my first experience was the Oklahoma City bombing, the Columbine shooting, and then it was 9/11, and then it was the Afghanistan war, and then the Iraq war, and it has been nonstop. And you had the back in after 9/11. Remember the code orange? If you were going to go fly, it was code orange that day. There might be a terrorist. It's just this constant keeping you on edge, and really propagated by the news because it's profitable, of course, but it's also a mind control aspect where if you don't allow people a chance to reconnect, it's easier to control, I would think.
Well, absolutely. And the same with the so-called pandemic, that to separate us, cover our races, keep us separated, and then inject fear every day through corporate media. I mean,
Yes.
all we have to do is figure out who owns the media. Well, if Big Pharma owns 70% of our nightly news, who's going to be telling a story of Big Pharma? And we know that they censored doctors who said, wait a minute, this is not true. We treat it this way. Because we were told there's no treatment for it whatsoever. Just stay home until you can't breathe and then go to the hospital. Well, respiratory diseases need to be treated. And people started treating them with medicines they'd known for half a century to work. But those medicines could not be obtained easily. The doctors were censored. Some of them lost their licenses. So if you have the power, then that's how you control. You let only your truth be told. And now we really have a way to do it, because if you own the media, you know, it's
Well, I don't know for you, but for me, that was discouraging to watch that happen,
oh,
because
heaven with.
I thought there was the possibility of maybe more people being aware of the control that was taking place.
Well,
And
there were millions, but they were censored. We didn't hear about them. Immediately, there was a declaration written by many doctors objecting to what was going on. They, of course, did personal character assassination on
yeah,
anyone. But I am in touch with many, many scientists and clinicians and independent journalists, but we have to know where to go to get them, because they've been censored and they have to get different kinds of means of getting on, having their own podcast, for example, and news outlets, so that they can't be wiped out. It certainly isn't on YouTube, because many have been, that's just been wiped out if you say anything that.
well, that's why
So
we started off as a podcast only, audio only, and of course, it always turns to video, but which is nice. Video is nice to have, but you can't control. You can't really censor podcasts, which is a beautiful thing because it's an RSS feed, and so
yeah,
it gets out there. But which
and
is go ahead. I'm
oh,
sorry.
I just gonna say, and there are many, many,
Yes, yeah, and it's fascinating to watch because I think there's a million podcasts like this where people just want to talk about other people's perspectives about the same events we all experienced.
yeah, to try to figure it out together and hear all voices. Whereas on the corporate media, there's only one story.
Mm.
Here in California, there was a law that became effective first of this year, in which a medical doctor cannot speak to his patient about COVID-19 unless it is the official narrative. He can't say anything that he has learned. It has to be the official narrative. And of course, that's big pharma, as official
And I
narrative.
think it's a misdemeanor charge against them, or it's a serious charge against
It's
them if
serious.
they do.
It's
Yeah, of
serious. Of course, they're being sued by several
course.
groups.
Yeah, yes. But it's the attempts are being made at an alarming rate that we haven't seen before.
Yes, all over the country.
Yes, and they've been inching it forward. You know what? We've been covering the weirdest story about cat litter in bathrooms. Have you heard about this?
No.
Okay, so it's my one of my co-hosts, his wife is a track coach, and she said that their school board in Colorado was getting ready to vote whether to allow one stall for them to install cat litter for kids that identified as furries. So this is kids who dress
Kids
up
have
like
been,
a cat or a dog when they go to school, and they identify as such, and so they should be. It sounds ridiculous, right, Betty?
yeah, I'm afraid
Okay.
so.
Okay, so that's what I thought. So I Googled it, and I saw a couple stories saying that this wasn't true and da da da, and it was a fake story. But my co-host's wife, she wouldn't lie about something like that. So I started asking around, and I live in a very small neighborhood in South Dakota, which when it comes to politics is as conservative as any other conservative state. I mean, they pull hard red over here, and so I told one of these fathers in a small town about this story, and so he went, and his kids were in private school, so he went to his buddy and asked him because his kids were in the public school, and they're like, "There's no way." So they call up their principal, and sure enough, on their ticket for the school board meeting is a question about putting in cat litter for a bathroom stall, designating one. And so I call my uncle, whose wife is a teacher in northern Minnesota. Same thing being, and I'm talking small communities where such a thing doesn't exist. Kids that dress up as cats, you know.
Yeah.
But it went through the entire school system, and now I found out in Virginia. I just got back from a conference with electricians, and one electrician in a school in Virginia, they have installed cat litter inside of a school bathroom.
We're going through some strange times. Oh,
Well, and it's not a coincidence that I think when we talk about these experiences into another realm, a lot of people think like LSD or some drug induced a matter to lower your I guess I don't know how we describe it, but to raise you to a higher level. But I mean, that's when the government started exploring LSD, it seemed like they became so scared of it that they just immediately banned it with no research done whatsoever.
well, they continued their research. They knew its
Yes,
power,
yes,
but they
they did.
banned it for everybody else. I have to say that for 40,000 years, our ancestors have used various plants and for altered states of consciousness. Now, the San Bushmen were in the desert. They did not. They developed techniques of dancing with certain chimes and sounds to achieve that. And they also could develop this energy field so powerfully that they could even form this energy like into a needle or a little arrow and throw it at someone, and that would kind of awaken them. They learned all kinds of ways of using this energy from a higher frequency. But our ancestors used it in Eleusis in Greece. They used a plant medicine so that everyone who went would achieve a vision and know that there is no need to be afraid of death. It doesn't exist. So I think in America, we haven't understood. Our ancestors treated these plants with great respect and a sense of the sacred, because they said the spirit comes into the plant, and when we cooperate together, when I take them in a sacred ceremony, then that can raise my frequency. They are here to help us do that. It's like partnership. It's not dependency. It's like the spirits in this sacred, powerful plant, when it combines with our consciousness, awakens, and we can experience universal consciousness. Now, we can put it another way. We are all born out of universal cosmic consciousness, but we have a valve that limits that amount of consciousness. So you and I can sit here and talk, or so I can buy groceries and cook dinner. But every civilization has to be aware that there are techniques to release that valve so that who we are, this cosmic consciousness, can flow through us. And sacred plants have been and remain one method. There are others, certainly meditation, and there are many different techniques of achieving that. And every civilization should make it its business to know, how do we release that valve and remember who we are? So, but during the 60s, America found out about it and didn't know anything. They used it indiscriminately, and people were harmed in many ways. And most people in our culture don't really know about those plants. Yes, that is a way, but there are other ways. The important thing is that we know we are universal consciousness. Every civilization has the responsibility to know what these are. If it is architecturally constructing a temple in which, when we walk in the right mode and mood and attitude, that those frequencies can ignite that altered state. Our ancestors knew this, and we're just beginning to discover it.
What do you think happens if the majority of people start to tune into themselves and discover this? How does the world change?
Well, I think we'll find that out. We know that when we have those experiences, their heart consciousness, that's love. That's understanding that we are all one. That's always what the mystic knows, is that we are one, and we are playing all of these roles. I mean, universe is creative. It needs us all, the creativity, like all of those threads in the tapestry. It is incredibly unlimited in its creativity, but we are all one. And I think the more we tune into that, the more love we have, the more it awakens that love in the heart, the more we care for each other. We want each person to achieve the creativity that he or she came to achieve in time and space. So we work together. And if we are involved in heart consciousness, we're not aggressive. So we will create a very different world. And I do think my experience has been through these last few years, and earlier too, when I was teaching, is that right now there are many people who know what we've been talking about, and they are working, first of all, to help us all know what's going on and how we can develop these techniques inwardly.
Do you think when did human nature turn to this, rule over others mentality? It feels like that's been the way of man since the beginning.
Well, I think it hasn't been, but that's what we were taught. And I have a good friend who was an archaeologist over at UCLA who discovered old Europe. And that is, she discovered from about, let's say, 6,000 BCE, there were so many people during that time, the Neolithic age, there were no wars. They were peaceful, joyful, had temples. It was a very different culture. They had many, many different symbols, a whole different symbolic system, and they were peaceful. And so that was a delight to read her work. And certainly we know that the cave cultures for 25,000 years were peaceful. The San Bushmen, 27,000 years at least peaceful. It's when, and we know that when we began to develop left brain linear reading, linear thinking, that there's an aggressiveness that develops, because what we did in the West is that we finally just focused on the left brain, and we were not letting the right brain, which is connected to higher brain centers in the heart, feed the left brain. Well, it always does feed it, but the left brain was developing its sense of superiority, you know. So that was aggressive. But from 40,000 BCE, these cave cultures were peaceful. The sand were peaceful. The old European cultures were peaceful. And then this developed into this beautiful old Egyptian symbolism or spiritual tradition. So when did we get really, really aggressive? About 4,000 BCE, there were tribes that came from the east, and they flooded into old Europe, and they had weapons of war. They didn't have them in old Europe. So the archaeologist's name was Maria Gimbutas, and she was trying to say, you know, that it's possible to be peaceful. We have been peaceful. These people, thousands of years. When the patriarchal cultures came in, of course, they're more left brain, you know.
Yeah,
And
the law. Well, anything with the legal system. Yeah,
exactly. You do as I say. And they overwhelmed these cultures, so much so that we didn't even know that there was such a culture that existed until the 20th century. And now they are trying, many of the people in the universities are refusing to teach Maria Gimbutas. It's as though she doesn't exist. All that she said was, you know, doesn't exist.
This is the archaeologist from UCLA.
Yeah, and this is how it happens. We make these breakthroughs, and then the academic world very often won't go along. They're sometimes the last to learn. Well, she was academic, but now they don't want to teach her.
We did a story on the orphans of Davenport by Mary Blackwood, and it was when they discovered that nurturing was important versus, nature versus nurture and raising a child. And this was in the 1920s during the eugenics craze. And they believed that it was all nature, all in your genetics. You were capped out.
So crazy. Yeah.
And when these four psychologists in the University of Iowa discover that that's not true, and they're shunned for 40 years before, I think it was 1961, they were finally recognized for their studies back in the 30s.
This is so typical. It's the same with the cave cultures. When there was a person who had the portable art from Altamira Cave, and he saw these paintings there, and he said it's the same, it's ancient. And he presented it at a conference, European conference on archaeology. They laughed him out of the room practically. They would have nothing. They really hurt him deeply. Do you know they wouldn't even go look at it for 20 years?
Really?
This is not scholarship.
It's a club. It's a club.
Yeah. And it's the same today. I see people in the university who just listen to authority and don't go to the source to find out what's going on today, what's behind what's happening today. I thought that if we went to university, we were supposed to be taught how to evaluate information, how to evaluate sources. But instead, so many are simply taking what they get on corporate news or New York Times. And I mean, this is filtered through with the CIA and corporate news and the government now in cahoots with all of it. It seems to me that if we're supposed to be smart, we were trained to evaluate that kind of thing.
Well, and it's fascinating too, because with this invention of the iPhone in 2007 and smartphones in general, and then the accessibility to what are social media, which I always think is funny. They always name it the opposite of what it does. So social media.
Good point. Very good point.
It is true, because it creates the most unnatural interaction you can have with a human.
I love it. Yeah. And see, with my generation, I'm glad if I can get in touch with someone, but it's just outside. I don't want that kind of contact.
Well, and how many times do you go to a restaurant and see how many people
are on their phone? Sitting on their phone or walking down the street? No,
grandparent and grandchild sitting across from each other, just texting or playing games.
That is horrible. I know. I had a friend who took her granddaughter to New York, and she said, I might as well not have been there. She was texting her friends the whole time, and I, slept with the phone. Oh, this is something we need to take seriously.
That's a tool to keep people from being attached to, who their true being is, like,
It's absolutely true. And during the 60s, students I had were like you. I mean, they were questioning this stuff, but they didn't have to contend with the social media part. But I think that I am just excited today to see people like you, people who are saying, wait a minute, what? And they're questioning it, you know? Good, you're an electrician. We can be anything. What's important is not did we go to the university to get a degree, but do we know how to question? Are we curious, enough to go
well,
to?
that's the tagline for the
Yeah, I love
podcast.
it. I
It's a
like it.
podcast for the curious mind
And
because
it's exactly what we need.
yeah, there's nothing wrong with asking questions. You talk to some people, I'm in preparation for this, a lot of people when you talk about it, especially out here, there's just such a negative view of it as it's drug related. It's wrong. It can't be good for you because it's drug related. You gotta, mushrooms or drugs. Well, I don't know
That
if that classifies, but that's just the type of, that's 60, 70 years of straight propaganda telling you.
it is, and that's what the government did with LSD. When it realized what was possible with LSD, then it started as propaganda, and it continued to do research with it.
Yes,
Uh,
Operation Chaos and
yeah, we have to go to sources and find out for ourselves what really is going on. When I taught mythology and I taught the mystery schools, I taught this, and I thought, what kind of teacher am I if I don't know what these mystery schools were talking about when they use the plants? What about shaman? If I don't know what I'm talking about, so I knew I must enter into those experiences and discover for myself what they're all about. Otherwise, what kind of teacher would I be?
well, you can have good experiences, but you can also, I would think, be able to create bad experiences
You
as
can have whatever it is that you need to experience, and it can be depending upon our mindset. It can be dangerous. That's why, among our ancestors, it wasn't the kids running off and hiding and using drugs. No, it was a ceremony in which the elders, the grandparents, the parents were there, and you were initiated into plant knowledge, which was knowledge of who you are. It wasn't helter skelter craziness.
do you
No,
think like with the Mayans, because they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people at their temples,
I
or
don't think the Mayans did. I think it was others, but not. I don't believe it was the Mayans. Was
um
it?
early on, yeah, they found 100. I think they said when they introduced the new temple, it was a 2-week festival, and they slaughtered someone every 4 seconds. And
It's
but I
it,
mean, there are examples, and maybe Mayans isn't a good one. I just think of them because of the civilization they had built. But where there's a human sacrifice element to bring forth um, um, otherworldly experiences as well. It's not just plant based or partaking of things. It seems like there's also other ways to go about it.
well, I think the killing though is a degradation. It's not what's going to bring about an altered state. But think of it with the Jesus story that Jesus had to die for us. How could someone's dying enlighten me? We need to really take that seriously. That's talk about misinformation. That's a misunderstanding. No one can die, or no one's dying is going to save me and give me enlightenment. But there was a deep fear and misunderstanding that brought that kind of sacrifice about.
What do you think brought about this belief in human sacrifice of being able to bring forth gods or appease gods?
I think it's probably, I don't know, but I think it's probably a lot of fear of giving up that which you most value, like your firstborn son. Remember the story in the Bible, which then the new God says, no, no, no more sacrifice. And I think in various temples, yes, there were sacrifices. They believed they had to give up something. It's a, uh, it's when the true myth is this, is that when we enter into the journey to achieve a higher consciousness or higher frequency, we die to our old way of looking at the world. We must die. We must be willing to let these old ideas die in us to allow room for the other. And somehow or other, it's, kill somebody else, let them do it for us. But it's a kind of fear-based insanity, really.
That's interesting because it then becomes sort of a cheap substitute, doesn't it?
Oh, I should say it does. I mean, no one can die to save me. I have to die to my limited ways of living in the world and understanding the world. I have to die to that old frequency. Nobody can do
That's
it for us.
and by saying that Jesus died for your sins, that sort of denotes the fact that you had no control in any of the situation whatsoever.
Yes, and Jesus, or we after World War II, we found the Nag Hammadi text in Egypt, which were texts which the church in the late 300s visited and said, "You either get rid of these texts or we'll burn them." The priest at Nag Hammadi buried them, and we found them after World War II. These present a different Jesus, the Jesus that was very well known in early Christianity. And in these texts, Jesus makes it clear, I did not come to die for you. I came to remind you of who you are.
That'd be very similar to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, then.
And that's, yes, a part of that tradition, certainly. And around the Dead Sea, these were Jews. They weren't Christians. That was earlier.
Right.
It was found after World War II, but they were earlier. They had gone against the Second Temple. They were mystics. And again, it's, of course, Jesus. Margaret Barker says Jesus was actually an attempt to revive the First Temple tradition, which would be it's the same that the Dead Sea Scrolls are doing, but they weren't a part of the Jesus tradition. But Jesus was around the time that they were ending, really. But
So you have more of a Jewish view of Jesus as more like an Elijah or, just a shaman himself.
I think so. I think he was a shaman and a mystic, and he wanted to ignite that potential in us. And yes, he was certainly a Jew and part of the Jewish tradition. But then when the church came along, they took the Jesus story and inverted it. Jesus was teaching us how to, he even taught techniques, the round dance, other things of how to ignite in us the knowledge of who we are and to love. That was the heart consciousness, is what Jesus taught. But when the church got hold of him, it was no, he was a God. He was outside you. You must worship him. You must obey him. You must do as he says. And that was a power structure. So Jesus was in the Jewish tradition. They let him go because the Christian took him over and so inverted him that they couldn't have much to do with him anymore. But basically, he was a Jew. And I think Margaret Barker's right that he really, that was a Jewish attempt in those mystical communities to reignite the mystic Judaism. But the church got hold of him. But these Nag Hammadi texts are wonderful because they really do show us that no, he didn't come to die for us, but to help us to know remember who we are. We can achieve Christ. It's not enough to follow the Christ. You must become the Christ.
And that was the model story. Do you believe that Jesus was a real person then? Or?
I think that there were people in those mystical communities who were like Jesus. So we don't know historically whether a particular person Jesus lived, but certainly a person such as Jesus did live because they had the knowledge of the mystical cosmic Christ consciousness. The Therapeutae, the Essenes, Jews who were mystics, they could very well have brought forth such a person. And, it's an interesting story that even one of the church fathers believed that it was the Therapeutae those Jewish mystical communities that wrote the Gospels. And so there's some connection there.
And you're saying that Jesus is just one of many examples of people that have lived in a way where they're encouraging others to find their own abilities.
Well, I don't want to reduce his consciousness. I think that, and I don't know how many people on our planet have achieved that, but there certainly have been those who have achieved these higher states of consciousness. They don't always maintain them, but I think once they can be achieved, we are different because we know something very different about the universe and about ourselves. But there have been those, yes, who have achieved these higher frequency levels of consciousness, maintained it to some degree or not. But I think, old Richard Burke he wrote Cosmic Consciousness, the book, because he was with his friends. He was a Canadian living in the 1800s. He was with his late 1800s friends. They were talking about poetry and music and all of these things. And he got in the carriage to go home and he looked ahead and he thought the city was on fire. And then he realized this light was coming from within himself. And he said it was just spontaneous, but he had been so focused on these things that night and in his life that he had this consciousness that everything is alive. The earth is a living consciousness. We are. And what did I say, Burke? It's Buck, Richard Maurice Buck. B-U-C-K. Kim is giving me the right name, Buck, of course. And he said, I knew in that moment that everything is alive. There is no such thing as death. We are immortal and we're creative. So he had that experience. And I think that he tried to go back in history to see how many had it. I think many have had that today. And this is what we must nurture in ourselves and in each other, that we are all capable of this, of Christ consciousness. And that should be the aim of all civilizations, not to fight each other. If we treated each other with that knowledge, we wouldn't be fighting,
Well, I mean, even the principle of the golden rule,
Exactly. It's a very good principle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works.
Well, Betty, thank you so much for coming on the show. We normally cut it off at an hour, but I feel like I could talk for 3 hours. So.
Yes. Well, congratulations to you for all the work you're doing. And it's so important, if you can get information to one or two other people, that's a wonderful thing. And
I love the conversation, because it's nice to sit there. I have a lot of people tell me they just, after they listen to our show, they're just like, get to think about it for a little bit.
That's good. That's good.
Well, we got great guests like you. I don't do it. I just ask questions. So.
Well, yes, but that's the essential thing to do.
You're welcome on. You're welcome on anytime, Betty. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. Take care.
Well, I guess, is there anything you want to plug? I know your books you can purchase on Amazon.
Yes, or you can also purchase them at Kamlak, KAMLAK.com. And I have a lot of videos, webinars, podcasts, things like that on that site too.
That's
Kamlak. Kamlak, KAMLAK. But you can also, of course, get them at Amazon. Anywhere books are sold or ebooks.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Betty.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a good rest of your day. That was Betty Kovak, who joined the show. Interesting conversation. You have any questions, leave it in the comment line below. And next week, Devin returns. Have a good rest of your